Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Nurses Hub. So, I had a whole screed written out, and I was going to bore you with some statistics about how many thousands of people died from polio and measles and whooping cough and diphtheria and scarlet fever, and now people just don't die from that. So, by and large, people were getting a lot of protection from vaccines until Andrew Wakefield, who was a gastroenterologist in the United Kingdom, came out with a paper that said that the MMR vaccine caused autism. And so basically the medical world went into a frenzy. There were other research groups who then tried to replicate his results and couldn't. And in a nutshell, he basically fabricated quite a fair bit of his methodology and his statistics and the outcomes. And so there have been hundreds of studies done since, and none of them find a correlation between vaccines and autism, particularly the measles, mumps, rubella. So Andrew Wakefield was then investigated, and he was charged and he was deregistered. And so he's no longer allowed to practice medicine. So he's written quite a number of books, and he's also come out, you've probably seen the movie Vax. Now, the movie Vax is full of conspiracy theory and not a lot of fact. And unfortunately, people thrive on conspiracy theory. They thrive on the idea that people are being hoodwinked, by the larger government, and they're going to come out being the saviour of everybody. But that's not the case. It's not the case. There aren't a whole heap of researchers and doctors and governments and pharmacologists and whatnot trying to hoodwink you into selling you a vaccine that you don't need. We've seen people in the iron lungs in hospitals. We've all seen those pictures. We've seen pictures of little babies trying to breathe who've got whooping cough. It's just not the case that we're trying to be hoodwinked by all these people trying to sell us a vaccine. It's just not the case. But autism is on the rise. And why is it on the rise? So what we need to do is have a look at how we classify autism. What makes somebody autistic as opposed to not autistic in the eyes of the medical profession. So we didn't have a framework by which diagnosis for mental disorder was standardised until 1952. And that's when they created a document, a publication called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Model for Mental Disorders. I'm not going to say that again, it's a mouthful to say it once. So I'm just going to talk about the DSM. So we had the original DSM in 1952, and autism was classified as a trait of schizophrenia. It was classified under schizophrenic disorders. So you weren't diagnosed with autism, you were diagnosed with schizophrenia. In 1967, that didn't change a great deal. That was DSM-2. So autism was then just a symptom of schizophrenia. It wasn't until 1980 that DSM-3 came out. And DSM-3 listed childhood autism. But the biggest issue with diagnosing childhood autism is that you either had to have absent speech or nonsensical speech. And you had to have bizarre behaviours towards normal social interactions. This only captured the most extreme people within the autism spectrum. But at least it captured them, it started. So in 1987, you would have thought that it would have been DSM-4. No, they just revised DSM-3. So it was called DSM-3R. So in 1987, they developed 16 diagnostic, they created a diagnostic tool for diagnosing autism, and there were 16 traits of which you had to satisfy 8. And you still had to have absent speech or nonsensical speech. That was the main criteria. Yes, it went a long way to diagnosing people who weren't otherwise diagnosed, and properly having a framework where there was consistency across the diagnoses. But it still wasn't capturing a good proportion of people who were on the spectrum. It wasn't until 1994 that they actually recognised that there were people on the spectrum who had perfectly good speech. They could interact, they could work, but they still had autism. So what that meant was that people who were otherwise denied services and funding and therapies and treatment were now able to access all of these. And I'm actually really heartwarmed by it, because the fact that autism rates are increasing means that the medical profession since 1994 is now taking autism seriously and giving the funding that it so richly deserves. And people are getting treatments and therapies and assistance and support. Whereas before, people with autism, the good proportion of people with autism and their families were just left to flounder by themselves. It's not right. And it doesn't have anything to do with vaccines. Vaccines had nothing to do with the increase in autism. None of it. And so they genuinely wanted to find out whether there was an increase in autism or whether there was just an increase in diagnosis. So there was a study done in Western Australia, and they had a look at 1,200 children who were diagnosed with autism. And they looked at it over a period of 10 years. Now, this study was only published last year, 2017, although it did study children from earlier in 2006 onwards. And what it discovered, I'm going to put up a graph, and it's got all these bars on it going across the time period that they did the study. And they looked at people who had a diagnosis of autism who had either 0, 1, 2 or 3 extreme characteristics of autism. Now, you would expect that if there was an increase in autism, not just an increase in diagnosis, if there was a genuine increase in autism, then you would see an increase across everything. So what I'm really heartened by is that the pink boxes, the ones where there were no extreme characteristics, so the people with mild to moderate autism is increasing, which means that we're taking it seriously. People who are taking their children to the doctors and saying there's something wrong. The doctors are actually listening and they're diagnosing appropriately. So I just want to leave you with a couple of parting gestures. The first one is, if it moves, vaccinate it. The second one is hit the subscribe button and tap on the bell icon, and you'll be notified for every new video that I do. Thanks for watching. This has been another episode of the Nurses Hub.